The bill arrived in one of those black leather folders that expensive restaurants use to make the moment of payment feel like something other than what it is. The waiter set it down at the center of the table with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who has delivered thousands of bills to thousands of tables and has learned through experience that the best thing to do is place the thing and disappear, because what happens next is rarely his business and sometimes uncomfortable to witness. 14 people at that table. My daughter, her husband, his parents, his 2 brothers and their wives, 4 of their collective children who were old enough to sit at a restaurant without requiring supervision, and 2 of my daughter's friends from work who had been included because, as my daughter had explained when she organized the dinner, it would be nice to have everyone together, a real celebration, a proper family gathering. My family, her husband's family, 2 of her work friends, 14 people, 1 bill. The bill sat in its leather folder for approximately 45 seconds before my daughter turned to me. "Dad," she said, "would you mind?" I looked at the folder. I looked at her. I said, "Of course." I stood up. I wished everyone a good evening, and I walked out of that restaurant without opening the folder, without touching the folder, without leaving a card or a signature or a single dollar on that table, and I drove home in the particular quiet of a man who has just made a decision that he has been, without fully knowing it, approaching for a very long time. My name is Edward Callahan. I am 58 years old, and this is the story of a $4,800 dinner, the 14 people who ate it, and the precise, specific moment when I understood the difference between a man who says of course and means yes, and a man who says of course and means never again. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, in the kind of neighborhood where the houses are small and the yards are large, and the people who live there understand, without being told, that the difference between having something and not having it is the distance between working for it and waiting for it to arrive. My father worked at a rubber plant for 30 years. My mother took in alterations and sewing work from a room off the kitchen that smelled of fabric and warm iron, and the specific industry of a woman who understood that every dollar had to be made before it could be spent. I was not a remarkable student. I was not a remarkable athlete. I was, by most measures, an unremarkable boy in an unremarkable place. And the one thing I had going for me was the thing my father demonstrated every morning at 5:30 when he put on his work clothes, and every evening at 5 when he came home with a kind of tiredness that belongs to people who have given their full effort to something for the full duration of a day. That thing was showing up. I graduated from high school in 1984. I took a job at a local plumbing supply warehouse while I figured out what to do with myself, and somewhere in the course of that job, the early mornings, the physical work, the satisfaction of a truck loaded correctly and a delivery made on time, I figured out that what I actually wanted to do was build things. Not plumbing specifically, but construction. The physical act of taking a piece of land and making it into something that had not existed before. I spent 5 years in the trades. Framing, then rough carpentry, then, gradually, the project management side of things, which suited me because I am the kind of person who can hold a complex sequence of events in his head and move the pieces into position in the right order. I started my own contracting business in Tisica, Davidsot, Devenosta with a used truck, a set of tools, and a single residential remodel that I won by underbidding everyone else and delivered on time, which is how almost every contractor I have ever respected got started. Callahan Construction is now, 31 years later, a mid-sized commercial and residential contracting firm based in Columbus, Ohio, with 46 employees, a roster of ongoing projects, and an annual revenue that I will not specify here because the number is not the point of this story. The point of this story is a dinner at a restaurant in Columbus called Trentino, which is the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't have prices on the side that goes to the guests, and where a bottle of wine costs more than most people's car payment, and where I once paid a bill for 14 people that I have spent the month since calculating, in ways that have nothing to do with the dollar amount. I married my wife Carol in 1999. She was a dental hygienist from Akron, which is where we met, and she was practical and funny and had a laugh that started low and built until it occupied the whole room, and she was the best thing that happened to me in my 20s, and I am still grateful for her, even now, even after the cancer that took her in 2015, even after everything that the absence of her produced in the years that followed, which is what this story is actually about. We had one child, a daughter named Melissa, born in 1995. She is now 29 years old, and she has her mother's laugh and her mother's eyes, and a relationship with money that is entirely her own, which is to say, it is a relationship with money that belongs to other people, specifically to me, and it is a relationship that I allowed to develop over a long period, in the way that relationships develop when nobody stops them, gradually, without announcement, in small increments that seem reasonable until you add them all up. Let me tell you how it started. Carol died in April of 2015. Breast cancer, diagnosed in the fall of 2013, treated for 18 months with the specific courage and practical humor that characterized everything Carol did, and then, on a Tuesday morning in April, simply gone. The way things that have been fighting for a long time eventually stop fighting, quietly, almost without drama, as though the whole effort had been building toward this specific silence. Melissa was 20 years old when her mother died. She was in her second year at Ohio State, studying communications, and the way she handled her mother's illness and death said something about her that I want to be fair about, as I tell the rest of this. She was, in that period, genuinely remarkable. She came home every weekend for the last 6 months. She sat with Carol. She talked to her, read to her, watched the old movies Carol loved, did all of it with a steadiness that surprised me, because 20 is young to have to be that steady, and not everyone manages it. What happened in the years after was not, I think, a character flaw. It was a pattern that developed in the specific absence Carol left behind, in the space where Carol would have said something, would have set a limit, would have looked at Melissa with that particular expression she had, the one that communicated love and absolutely not in the same glance. Carol was the one in our family who knew how to do that. I am a man who builds things, and the things I build are designed to bear weight. And somewhere in the years after Carol died, I began to apply that logic to my daughter in a way that did not serve either of us. The first time Melissa asked me for something significant beyond the normal college expenses I was already covering was in the fall of 2016, her senior year. She wanted to study abroad for a semester, Rome, a program her university offered that cost, with the flights and the housing and the living expenses, roughly $18,000 on top of her existing tuition. She came to me with it apologetically, in the way she always did in those early years, visibly uncomfortable asking, prefacing the ask with acknowledgments that it was a lot, that she understood if it wasn't possible, that she could look for other options. I said yes, without hesitation, without conditions, without asking her to contribute any part of it from her part-time job savings. I said yes because Carol had always wanted to go to Rome and never had, and because I was 51 years old and my wife was gone and my daughter's eyes were Carol's eyes, and I wanted to give her something good. That was the first yes. The years since have contained a significant number of additional yeses, and I want to walk you through them, not to produce a tally. I am not a man who keeps a grudge ledger, but because the pattern matters, and patterns are only visible when you lay the events side by side and look at the shape of them. After the Rome semester, Melissa graduated and moved to Columbus, and the first yes of her adult life was the apartment deposit and first month's rent. $6,000, a reasonable thing for a father to do for a daughter starting out. The second yes was the car. A reliable used car, $12,000, and I would make the same decision again, because Carol always said the most dangerous economy is the one that puts your kid in an unreliable vehicle. The third yes was the medical bills from a hospitalization in 2018, an appendix that needed to come out at 2 a.m, and Melissa's insurance at the time had a deductible that was more than she had in savings, and of course, I covered it. These were all individually reasonable things. I want to be clear about that. I am not telling you this story to make myself look like a man who was too foolish to see what was happening in front of him. I am telling you this story to explain how a reasonable man who makes reasonable decisions one at a time can arrive through an accumulation of reasonable decisions at a place that is entirely unreasonable. Melissa got married in 2020. Her husband is named Derek. He is 32, works in marketing, is pleasant enough in the limited way of a man whose pleasantness is the most distinctive thing about him, and has, as far as I can tell, an entirely comfortable relationship with the fact that his wife's father pays for things. Not a hostile relationship, not a grateful relationship, just comfortable. The way you are comfortable with a fact that has always been true in your experience. The wedding cost in total approximately $60,000. I paid $45 of those $60,000. The remaining 15 came from Derek's parents, who I had met 4 times before the wedding and who were, by their own description at the rehearsal dinner, which I also paid for, not in a position to contribute more, a statement they made without apparent discomfort while eating shrimp cocktail at $22 per person. The years of Melissa and Derek's marriage have contained the following additional significant financial events, all of which I'm going to list simply and factually, without editorializing, because the list speaks for itself. The down payment on their house, $30,000. The home improvement project they undertook a year after buying, $18,000. The business idea Derek had in 2021 that he wanted to try. A subscription-based food delivery concept that did not survive its first year, which I was asked to seed with $25,000, and which returned to me, when the business dissolved, $0. Melissa's car, the second one, because the first one I'd bought her was now 7 years old and she felt it was time, $14,000. The trip to Portugal last year for their 5th anniversary, which I was presented with as something they'd been saving for, though it became apparent during a conversation in the planning stages that the saving they had done covered approximately a third of the total cost. And the rest, would I be able to help? $11,000. The furniture for the nursery when Melissa got pregnant last year, $3,500. There is more, but I think you have the shape of it. What I want to say about all of this, before I get to the dinner, is this. I am not a man who was unaware. I am not a man who wrote each of these checks in a fog of ignorance about the pattern he was participating in. By 2022, by 2023, by every year since about 2021, I was aware, in the specific, uncomfortable way of a man who is watching something happen that he does not approve of and has not yet found the words to stop, that a dynamic had developed between my daughter and me that was not healthy for either of us. What I did not yet have was the moment, the specific moment that turns awareness into action, the moment that arrives not as a gradual decision, but as a sudden absolute clarity, like a switch being thrown. The dinner was that moment. Melissa organized the dinner in late October, a Saturday evening at Trentino. She called me about it 2 weeks in advance, which I mentioned because the advance notice is part of the architecture of the thing. It was not a spontaneous gathering that she hoped I might join. It was an event she planned, for which she selected the venue and the guest list and the date, and for which I would come to understand, the financial foundation, even though this was never stated explicitly, and, when I was invited, was presented as simply a chance to bring everyone together. The occasion, she explained, was a combined celebration, a belated anniversary dinner for her and Derek, who had just celebrated their 5th, and a welcome to the family gathering for Derek's brother's new girlfriend, who had been with him for 6 months and whom Melissa wanted to properly introduce to the extended group. She wanted it to feel special. She wanted it to feel like an occasion. She had picked Trentino because it was the nicest restaurant in Columbus, and it would make an impression. I said yes. I said I would be there. In the 2 weeks between that call and the dinner, I did not explicitly confirm that I would be paying. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not confirm it. Melissa did not explicitly ask me to pay. What happened, in the specific way that things in this kind of dynamic happen, was a complete absence of any other arrangement being discussed, which functioned as confirmation by default. A silence that both of us understood, without stating, to mean that there was only one person at that table for whom the bill was a possibility, and that person was me. I arrived at the restaurant at 7, the requested time. The table had already begun to fill. Melissa and Derek, Derek's parents, his 2 brothers and their wives, and several of the children seated along one side with the particular restless energy of children who have been told to behave in a nice restaurant. 2 women from Melissa's office arrived shortly after me. The work friends, who I had met briefly at the wedding and not seen since, who embraced Melissa warmly and who I noticed, as they settled into their seats and picked up their menus, did so with the complete ease of people who understood that the evening was hosted, meaning that the evening was free. Derek's brother's new girlfriend arrived last with Derek's brother and was introduced around the table with the specific ceremony of someone being presented to a family, which is a generous and lovely thing to do for a person, and which I noticed as I shook her hand and welcomed her, requires a host. A host is a person who provides something for the occasion. I was the only person at that table in any position to have provided something for the occasion. I had not chosen to host the evening, but I was, by the logic of every prior dinner and every prior yes, the default host. I picked up the menu. I want to tell you what the menu contained because the specifics matter. The restaurant's prix-fixe option started at $120 per person and went up to $165, depending on the wine pairing. The a la carte options were similarly constructed. Appetizers in the $40 to $60 range, mains in the $60 to $120 range. I am not a man who objects to spending money on a good meal. I have spent money on good meals in good restaurants with good company for 30 years, and I have done so gladly because good food in good company is one of the genuine pleasures available to people who have worked to afford it. What I looked at over the menu was the table. 14 people, 8 of whom were either Derek's family or Melissa's work colleagues who I had met, combined, perhaps 6 times. 2 of whom were children who would order pasta and eat half of it, one of whom was a woman I was meeting for the first time, one of whom was Derek, whose relationship with my money was comfortable in the way I have described, one of whom was Melissa, who had organized this dinner at this restaurant on this scale for this number of people, and who had not once, in the 2-week period between the invitation call and tonight, made any alternative arrangement for how the bill would be handled, and one of whom was me. The dinner lasted 2.5 hours. I ate well. The restaurant deserved its reputation, and I am not a man who punishes himself for the behavior of others by refusing a good meal. I talked to Derek's parents, who were pleasant in the resigned way of people who have long since made their peace with a son who relies on a father-in-law. I talked to one of Derek's brothers, who worked in logistics and had interesting things to say about supply chain management, which overlaps enough with construction procurement that we found common ground. I talked to the new girlfriend, whose name was Sarah, who was a physical therapist and who was smart and direct and had nothing to do with any of this and seemed on brief acquaintance, like a genuinely decent person. I watched Melissa at the center of the table, managing the evening with the specific, warm competence she has always had in social situations. The laughter that starts low and builds, Carol's laugh, filling the room. She was good at this. She is her mother's daughter in the ways that matter most for a dinner party. I watched her, and I felt, as I often feel I watch her, the particular mix of love and something more complicated that has characterized my relationship with her for the past several years, love that is complete and unqualified, and the something more complicated that is what love becomes when it has been organized, over time, into a structure that does not serve the person you love. When the dessert was cleared, the conversation had settled into the warm, slightly unfocused quality of a table near the end of a good dinner. The waiter appeared. The black leather folder was placed at the center of the table. 45 seconds. My daughter turned to me. "Dad," she said, "would you mind?" The table waited, not anxiously. There was no anxiety in the room about this question, which told me everything I needed to know about how fully this outcome had been assumed. The table waited with the mild, comfortable attention of people who expect the natural conclusion of an evening to arrive in the next 60 seconds, allowing them to put on their coats and say their goodbyes. I looked at the folder. I looked at my daughter. I thought about Carol, who would never have organized a dinner like this and would never have asked a question like that, not because she couldn't, but because she understood something my daughter has not yet learned, that the ease with which you ask someone for something is the clearest possible signal of how much of their effort you have accounted for. I thought about the Rome semester and the car and the appendix and the wedding and the house down payment and the renovation and Derek's food delivery business and the Portugal trip and the nursery furniture and every yes I had said in the years since Carol died, each of them reasonable in isolation, all of them together forming a shape that I had been looking at sideways for years and was now, in the light of a very expensive restaurant on a Saturday evening, seeing directly for the first time. I said, "Of course." I pushed my chair back. I stood up. I looked around the table, at Melissa, at Derek, at his parents, at his brothers, at the work friends, at the children who had eaten half their pasta, at Sarah the physical therapist who had nothing to do with any of this, and I said to all of them evenly and without performance, "It's been a wonderful evening. I hope everyone has a safe drive home." And then I put on my coat, and I walked through the restaurant, and I pushed open the front door, and I stood on the sidewalk in the October air, and I got in my car, and I drove home. My phone started ringing before I had reached the end of the block. Melissa first. I let it go to voicemail. Then Derek. I let that go too. Then Melissa again. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I later understood was one of the work friends who had apparently been designated in the moment as the person most likely to reach me because she was least likely to have caused offense. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the house that Carol and I bought in 2003 and that I have been living in alone since 2015. And I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:47, and I thought about the folder, still presumably on the table at Trentino, and about the 14 people who were now in some configuration dealing with a situation they had not anticipated. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because honesty requires including the parts that are not flattering. I felt something close to relief, and I am a little ashamed of how long it took me to find it. I also felt, underneath the relief, the familiar, complicated love for my daughter that does not diminish simply because I have stopped organizing my behavior around it. And I felt something I had not felt in relation to my own money and my own decisions in a very long time. I felt like the money was mine, not mine, in the angry, possessive sense of a man who has been taken from and wants his things back. Mine in the older sense. Mine the way the truck was mine in Tisicha Davidsot Devanost tree. Mine the way the first job was mine. Mine the way anything is yours. When you understand what it costs and what it means and what it is for. I did not check my phone until 11 o'clock. By then there were 14 missed calls. One each from Melissa, Derek, and the unrecognized number, and then a sustained and increasingly urgent sequence from Melissa, each voicemail slightly longer than the last, the arc moving through confusion to frustration to something more subdued that I recognized when I finally listened to them all at once as the sound of a person beginning to understand that the evening had not gone the way they expected, and that the understanding itself was more significant than the inconvenience of the bill. The bill, I should mention, was eventually covered. I know this because Melissa told me later, much later, in a conversation I'll get to, that Derek's mother had put it on her card. $4,863, including the wine and the service charge, and a dessert menu that the table had apparently continued to order from after I left. Derek's mother had put it on her card. I thought about Derek's parents at the rehearsal dinner 8 years ago, explaining that they were not in a position to contribute more. I thought about the way comfortable truths become uncomfortable when the landscape shifts around them. Melissa called me Sunday morning at 9. I answered. She said, "Dad." I said, "Melissa." She said, "What happened last night?" I want to tell you that this was the moment I delivered a perfectly structured, clearly articulated explanation of everything I have been telling you. The pattern, the years, the accumulation, the folder on the table. I want to tell you that I said all of it clearly and fully, and that she heard all of it immediately and understood. That is not quite what happened. What happened was more like the beginning of a conversation that would take, in its full form, several weeks, and several phone calls, and one long Sunday afternoon in November at this kitchen table with coffee, and the specific difficulty of two people who love each other working through something that has no clean ending. What I said that Sunday morning was, I didn't pay the bill because I realized, when the bill arrived, that I couldn't pay it and respect either of us at the same time. And I've been trying to respect both of us for a long time, and I haven't been doing a very good job of it, because what I thought was respect was actually just avoidance. She was quiet. I said, "I love you. I have loved you since the morning you were born, and I loved your mother for 24 years. And when she died, I did something that I think I understood, even at the time, was not entirely about you. I started saying yes to everything you asked because saying yes to you was the only way I had, for a while, of saying yes to her, of keeping something of her in my daily life, of doing something that felt like taking care of the family she left behind. A longer quiet, I said, and somewhere in those years, that became a system. I became a system, a resource. Not intentionally, not maliciously. I don't think you sat down and decided to treat your father as a financial structure, but systems developed from repeated behavior. And the repeated behavior was, Melissa needs something, Edward provides it. And I kept providing it because providing it felt like loving you, and I was afraid that if I stopped providing it, I would stop being necessary to you. Necessary in the way a father is supposed to be necessary. She said quietly, Dad. I said, let me finish. She let me finish. I said, what I understood when the bill sat on that table and you turned to me and asked if I would mind, what I understood was that the question itself was the answer. You organized a dinner for 14 people at the most expensive restaurant in the city, and you did it without making any other arrangement for how it would be paid, because you had never had to make any other arrangement, because I had always been the arrangement. And when you asked me if I would mind, you were not asking because you thought I might say no. You were asking because the asking was the form, not the question, and I realized in that moment that I had made the form necessary. I had done that, and the only way to unmake it was to answer the question honestly. She was crying by this point. I could hear it in the specific way that my daughter has cried since she was small. The attempt to hold it, and then the not being able to hold it, and then the giving in to it. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, I didn't know I was doing it. Not like that. I didn't know it looked like that. I said, I believe you, and I also think that not knowing how something looks is sometimes a choice we make because looking at it directly is uncomfortable. I've been making that choice too. We've both been not looking at this for a long time. She said, I don't want to be someone who does that. Who does what I've been doing? I said, I know you don't. You're your mother's daughter, Melissa. Your mother was one of the most careful, considerate people I have ever known. Careful with money, careful with other people's effort, careful with the way she asked for things, because she understood that asking is not free, even when the person you're asking loves you. You have her laugh and her eyes and her instinct for a room full of people. You can have her carefulness, too. That part doesn't have to be gone just because she is. A long silence. She said, What happens now? I said, What happens now is that you and Derek figure out your finances as though I am not part of them. Because going forward, I am not going to be part of them in the way I have been. I'm not punishing you. I'm not disappearing. I'm your father, and I love you, and I will help you when you genuinely need help, and when the help I give is something you've asked for honestly, not assumed. But I'm not a system, Melissa. I'm a person, and I have been using my role as your father as a reason not to be one. And that stops now. She said, Okay. I said, Okay. She said, Derek is going to have to hear this too. I said, Yes, he is. She said, He's not going to like it. I said, I know. I don't particularly need him to like it. She said, with something that, through the tears, was almost the beginning of a laugh, No, I don't suppose you do. I had the conversation with Derek the following Saturday at my house without Melissa present, which was her suggestion and which I thought was right. She said he needed to hear it from me directly, not through her, and that she would talk to him separately, and that the two conversations together would be more useful than the three of us in the same room. Derek is, as I said, a pleasant man. He is the kind of man who is easy to be around when nothing is required of him, and who becomes less easy to read when something is. He sat in my kitchen and he listened, and when I was done laying out what I had laid out for Melissa, he said, "I want to be honest with you, Ed." "Please," I said. "I've known for a while," he said, "that the way things worked between you and Melissa wasn't right. I knew it. I didn't say anything because it was easier not to, and because Melissa never seemed concerned about it, and I told myself that if she wasn't concerned, it wasn't my place to be. But I was taking the easy road." I said, "Yes, you were." He said, "I should have said something." I said, "You should have. But I also should have said something years ago, and I didn't. So I'm not in a position to be hard on you for doing the same thing I did." He said, "The dinner. I should have figured out the bill before we got there." I said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't because it hadn't occurred to me that there was anything to figure out. And I'm aware of how that sounds." I said, "How does it sound to you?" He thought about it for a moment with the specific expression of a person who is being more honest with themselves than they usually allow. He said, "It sounds like someone who has been comfortable for a long time and has been confusing comfort with fine." I said, "That's a reasonable summary." He said, "I'd like to try to be different. I think Melissa wants that too. I think last Saturday was something that needed to happen." I said, "I think so too." He said, "For what it's worth, and I know this doesn't undo anything, Derek's mom was, I think, actually relieved to pay. She said so later that night when we got home. She said she'd been wanting to contribute more for years and hadn't known how. I sat with that for a moment. There is something in the world, not justice exactly, but something adjacent to it, that occasionally arranges itself correctly, and the image of Derek's mother, who had told me at the rehearsal dinner that she was not in a position to contribute more, putting $4,800 on her card at the end of an evening is, I'll admit, an image that I return to with more frequency than is probably warranted. It has been 3 months since the dinner. Melissa and I talk every week. The calls are different now. Not different in an awkward, strained way, but different in the way that conversations are different when both people in them have stopped managing something. She tells me things about her and Derek's life that she did not tell me before. Small things, the actual texture of their days, the specific worries and small victories of two people building a life together in their early 30s on their own income. She has gone back to work part-time now that the baby is a few months old, and she talks about the work with an energy that I recognize, the energy of someone doing something for its own sake rather than waiting for the next arrangement to present itself. She visited me last month on a Sunday, and we sat at this table and we talked for 4 hours, in the way that people talk when they are telling each other the actual truth, which takes longer than the managed version, but contains something the managed version never does. The feeling, when you're done, that you've actually been somewhere together. She asked me at one point whether I regretted it. Walking out of the restaurant, I told her the truth, which is that I have not for a single moment regretted it, but that I have thought many times about why it took me so long, why it took a leather folder and a $4,800 bill for me to do something that I had the means and the right and the reason to do years earlier. She said, "You weren't ready." I said, "No." She said, "Were you waiting for something?" I thought about it. I thought about Carol and about the afternoon after the funeral when I had gone back to this house alone for the first time and sat at this table and understood, for the first time in 24 years, what it meant to not have her here. And I thought about the way I had started saying yes after that. Not recklessly, not foolishly, but compulsively. The way you reach for a light switch in a dark room, not because you think the light is there, but because reaching for it is what you do in the dark. I said, I think I was waiting to stop being afraid. She said, afraid of what? I said, that if I stopped being useful, I would stop being necessary. That if I said no, you wouldn't need me anymore. That the yes was the thing holding us together. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dad, the yes was the thing keeping us apart. I looked at her across the table. She has Carol's eyes. She has Carol's laugh. And she has, it turns out, when she is being fully honest, something close to Carol's precision. The ability to say the exact true thing in the exact right number of words. I said, I know that now. She said, so do I. We sat at the table for a while after that, in the quiet of a house that has been mine for 25 years and that has held in its time a great deal of everything that matters. The life Carol and I built, the child we raised, the decades of early mornings and work, and the particular satisfaction of making things that did not exist before. It is a house that has seen its share of things going wrong and things being fixed, which is, I suppose, appropriate for a house that belongs to a man who has spent his life in construction. My father used to say that the most important decision a man makes is not the first one, which is almost always made in circumstances that don't allow for much choice, but the last one, the one you make when you finally have enough information to make it correctly, when you understand the full weight of what you're deciding, and you decide anyway. I built a business from a used truck and a single job in 1993. I have made, in the years since, a great many decisions, some correct, some not, some that looked correct at the time and revealed themselves later to be something else entirely. I have built things, and I have miscalculated, and I have recovered, and I have built again, which is the rhythm of the work and of most things that are worth doing. The last decision, the one my father was talking about, was not the big ones. It was not the business or the house or even the marriage, though all of those were significant. It was a Saturday evening in October, a black leather folder, and a question I had been asked in various forms for 12 years. Dad, would you mind? I stood up. I said, of course, and I walked out. I have never in 3 months regretted a single step of it. See you in the next one.